Tonight, we are going to spend time with a story that has existed for centuries along rivers, lakes, and still waters throughout the Nordic regions. It is not a story that was meant to be told with urgency or drama. Instead, it lived quietly alongside daily life, mentioned during certain seasons, remembered near certain places, and sometimes left unspoken altogether. This is not a story that requires close attention or careful tracking of details. You can listen as much or as little as you like, letting the words remain steady in the background while your thoughts settle. The story we are exploring belongs to a time when water was not simply part of the landscape. It was a presence that shaped routines, influenced decisions, and required constant awareness. In those days, lakes and rivers were not recreational spaces or scenic views. They were resources, boundaries, and risks all at once. People lived near water because they needed it, and they learned to move around it with care. Over time, those observations and experiences became stories. Many of these stories were not created to explain everything clearly. They did not offer definitive answers or moral conclusions. Instead, they provided a way to speak about uncertainty, about boundaries, and about forces that existed beyond human control. When something happened without an obvious cause, or when the environment felt unpredictable, stories helped give shape to those experiences. They made them easier to talk about, easier to remember, and sometimes easier to accept. Tonight's story centers around a figure known as Nukken, sometimes called the Nix or Necken, depending on the region. Even the name carries a sense of distance and simplicity, offering just enough description to suggest an image without fully defining what that image should be. Depending on where the story was told and who was telling it, the details changed. In some places, the figure was spoken of carefully, almost indirectly. In others, it appeared more clearly in seasonal stories shared during certain times of year. There was never a single version that everyone agreed on, and that lack of certainty was part of what allowed the story to endure. Rather than thinking of this as one specific legend with a fixed beginning and end, it can be more helpful to think of it as a collection of related ideas that developed slowly over time. Ideas about water, about solitude, and about the quiet risks that accompanied everyday life near lakes and rivers. These ideas were not presented dramatically. They were woven into ordinary moments, often mentioned in passing, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a reminder, and sometimes simply as something that people accepted as part of the world they lived in. As we move through this story, we will not rush. There is no destination we are trying to reach quickly, and no message you are expected to uncover. Instead, we will spend time with the atmosphere in which this story existed, with the conditions that allowed it to take shape, and with the way people once experienced the world around them. We will talk about the legend itself, but we will also linger on the quieter details, the environment, the routines, and the moments when stories like this felt most natural to share. It is worth remembering that for much of history, storytelling was not a form of entertainment in the way we think of it today. Stories were not something separate from daily life. They were part of how people made sense of what they saw and experienced, especially when explanations were difficult to find. When water behaved unpredictably, stories reflected that unpredictability. When someone disappeared without clear reason, stories gave the loss a shape. And when the environment felt uncertain, Stories helped make it feel familiar, even if it remained uncontrollable. These stories were often shared without emphasis. There was no expectation that they would be remembered perfectly or repeated exactly the same way each time. What mattered was that they continued to exist, changing slightly as they moved from one person to another. Over time, certain images, themes, and patterns remained, while others faded away. This gradual process is what gave folklore its quiet resilience. As you listen tonight, you do not need to decide whether this story should be taken literally, symbolically, or simply as something people once believed. You do not need to place it into a specific category or evaluate it in any particular way. You can let it exist as it is, as a reflection of how people once interacted with their environment and with each other. The story does not demand interpretation, and it does not insist on meaning. It simply unfolds. Throughout this narration, we will take a slow, steady approach, allowing the words to move at a pace that feels comfortable and predictable. There will be moments when ideas repeat themselves in slightly different ways, and that is intentional. Repetition was part of how these stories were remembered, and it is also part of what makes them easy to listen to without effort. If your attention drifts, that is fine. If you miss a detail, nothing important is lost. So, as we begin, imagine a world with fewer distractions, where evenings were long and quiet, and where people became accustomed to stillness. A world where artificial light was limited, and where the sounds of the environment were more noticeable, simply because there was less competing noises. In that kind of setting, stories did not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. They just needed to be present. This is the kind of world in which the story of Nukan existed, not loudly and not urgently, but patiently, returning again and again in different forms, shaped by the people who remembered it and the conditions under which it was told. And this is where our journey begins. The story associated with Nukan does not appear as a single, clearly defined narrative that unfolds the same way each time it is told. Instead, it exists as a collection of related accounts that developed gradually, shaped by environment, repetition, and lived experience. These accounts were shared quietly, often without emphasis, and rarely with the expectation that they would be remembered exactly. What mattered was not precision, but familiarity. Over time, certain patterns remained while details shifted, creating a story that felt stable without ever being fixed. In many of the regions where this story was told, water was not a distant feature of the landscape. It was immediate and constant. Lakes dotted the terrain, rivers connected settlements, streams fed into larger waterways. These bodies of water were essential for fishing, travel, and daily tasks, but they also presented risks. Currents could be deceptive. Depths were difficult to judge. Surfaces appeared calm, while conditions beneath remained unknown. These characteristics created a natural setting for stories. That did not need exaggeration to feel plausible. The environment itself provided enough uncertainty. Within this setting, Nurkan appears not as a sudden intrusion, but as a presence that emerges naturally from the conditions around it. The figure is not introduced dramatically. It does not announce itself. In most tellings, the encounter occurs near water during moments that are already quiet or isolated. Someone approaches a lake at dusk. A child wanders near a river's edge. A traveler pauses by a still pool. The timing is consistent across many versions. The encounter does not happen when people are alert and occupied. It happens when attention has softened, When routines have paused, or when solitude has settled in, the person in these stories is rarely described in personal detail. Their name, age, and background are usually left unstated. They are defined by their proximity to water rather than by individual traits. This lack of specificity allows the story to feel applicable to anyone. The person could be anyone who has spent time near water alone, drawn by necessity or habit rather than intention. As the person approaches the water, the world around them begins to feel narrower. Sound is absorbed by the stillness. Light fades gradually. The boundary between land and water becomes more pronounced. These sensations are familiar and understated, and they ground the story in experiences that listeners would recognize. Nothing feels sudden. Nothing feels impossible. At some point, the person becomes aware of another presence. This awareness is not always visual at first. It may begin as a subtle change in the atmosphere, a feeling that something has shifted without a clear reason. When a figure does become visible, it is often from a distance or partially obscured. The outline may be indistinct, blending with reflections on the water's surface. It takes time for the person to recognize the shape as something distinct. When the figure resolves into a clearer form, the reaction is usually uncertainty rather than fear. A figure near water raises questions but not immediate alarm. Is someone fishing, waiting, simply resting by the shore? These questions remain unanswered. The person continues forward, drawn by curiosity or necessity rather than caution. Descriptions of Nukken vary from place to place, but certain qualities remain consistent. In many tellings, the figure appears in a form that seems to belong to the water itself. Sometimes described as pale, sometimes as shadowed, sometimes as shifting between states. The figure does not appear burdened by the cold water or affected by the dampness. Its movements are unhurried. It does not rush, and it does not seem strained by the conditions. This contrast between its calm presence and the person's growing awareness is subtle but significant. It marks the figure as different without making it overtly threatening. In some versions, Narken is associated with music. A sound carries across the water, faint and difficult to locate. It may be described as beautiful or haunting, though these words were not always used. More often, it is simply noted that a sound was heard, one that seemed to come from the water itself. This sound does not demand attention. It drifts, fades, and returns much like the figure itself. When the figure is noticed more clearly, its expression is usually neutral. It does not display strong emotion. If it speaks, its voice is quiet and even, unaffected by the wind or the water. It may ask a simple question about the time of day or comment on the stillness of the evening. Sometimes it says very little, allowing silence to stretch between words. As the interaction continues, the person begins to notice a change in how the environment feels. It does not become sharper or more intense. Instead, it grows heavier, more difficult to ignore. Time seems to slow, thoughts become less clear. The world seems to narrow further, reducing attention to the water's edge and the figure nearby. This change happens gradually, and that gradualness is essential. The story does not rely on sudden transformation. It relies on accumulation. In one common version of the story, Nukken invites the person closer to the water. The invitation is not forceful. It is framed as natural and reasonable. The evening is calm, the water is still. Coming closer seems sensible. In these tellings, the danger lies not in deception, but in distraction. The person is already drawn to the water, and the presence of the figure simply reinforces that pull. If the person accepts and moves closer, the story ends quietly. There is no struggle and no dramatic confrontation. Later, the person may be found near the water's edge, or they may not be found at all. There are no signs of violence and no explanation that fully satisfies those who search. The encounter remains an explanation rather than a fact, a way of making sense of a loss that otherwise feels sudden and arbitrary. In other versions, the person does not approach. Instead, Nurkan remains at the water's edge. The figure may play music or simply wait. The person becomes increasingly aware of their own fatigue, their own isolation, their own distance from safety. There is no sense of pursuit or struggle. Awareness simply begins to fade under conditions that can no longer be managed. In these tellings, safety comes not from strength or resistance, but from interruption. Another person appears unexpectedly. A light becomes visible from a nearby dwelling. Or the person remembers a warning they once heard, prompting them to turn away despite their distraction. When the person looks back, Nurkan is gone. The figure does not chase, it does not react, it simply disappears, leaving no trace of its presence. These early versions of the story emphasize restraint. Nurkan does not act with urgency. It does not display anger or desire. Its presence coincides with vulnerability rather than causing it. It appears where conditions are already uncertain, reflecting risks that exist regardless of its involvement. In this way, the story avoids framing the figure as a villain. It is not something to be defeated or escaped. It is something to be encountered, briefly and quietly, under specific conditions. This approach allowed the story to remain flexible. It could be told as a warning, a memory, or simply as something that had been heard before. It did not require belief or interpretation. It existed alongside daily experience, reinforcing what people already knew about water, isolation, and distraction, without insisting on meaning or resolution. In other tellings of the story, the setting shifts to moments when water becomes more central to daily activity. These versions often involve children who are frequently near water for practical reasons. Fetching water, washing clothes, tending to animals, or simply playing near familiar shores. In these stories, Nurkan does not appear suddenly or aggressively. Instead, it is noticed gradually, becoming part of the scene before being recognized as something distinct. Children in these tellings are rarely described as disobedient or careless. They are simply doing what children do, moving through familiar spaces without constant supervision. The encounter occurs not because of wrongdoing, but because of proximity and timing. The child is alone or momentarily separated from others. The light is fading. Attention has shifted to something else. These are ordinary circumstances, not extraordinary ones. In some versions, Nurkan takes the form of something familiar. A horse grazing near the water's edge. A white or grey animal that appears calm and unbothered by approach. This form was particularly common in Scandinavian tellings, where horses were part of daily life and their presence near water would not seem unusual. The child approaches, curious or simply drawn by habit. The animal does not move away. It waits. When the child reaches out to touch the horse or attempts to climb onto its back, the animal remains still. There is no sudden movement, no sign of danger. The child may succeed in mounting, feeling secure and pleased. Only then does the animal begin to move, stepping calmly toward the water. The transition is smooth. There is no alarm. The child may not realize immediately that something has changed. As the horse enters the water, the story becomes quieter still. There is no struggle described in most versions. The animal simply continues moving, and the water rises gradually. The child's awareness of danger comes too late, if it comes at all. In some tellings, the child calls out. In others, there is only silence. The outcome is not detailed, it is simply understood. In gentler versions of these stories, intervention arrives. Someone sees the child on the horse before it reaches the water. A voice calls out the child's name, breaking the trance. The animal dissolves or simply vanishes, leaving the child standing safely on shore. These versions emphasize the importance of attention and presence, suggesting that awareness itself can interrupt the encounter. There are also tellings where Nukken appears in human form near the water's edge, engaging children in conversation or play. The figure may seem friendly, asking simple questions or offering to show something interesting just beyond the shore. The danger lies not in aggression, but in gradual leading. One step closer, then another. The child follows without recognizing the accumulation of distance from safety. In these versions, harm is often averted by adherence to simple practices, calling the child by name, speaking clearly and directly, maintaining visual contact. These actions are not framed as magical protections or special knowledge. They are ordinary behaviors that reinforce connection and awareness. The story suggests that ordinary attentiveness is enough, that no special ritual or object is required. Other versions take place during festivals or gatherings near water, when music and celebration create distraction. Nukken is said to join in, unnoticed at first, blending with the crowd or the festivities. The music it plays is described as particularly compelling, drawing attention away from other sounds and sights. People may dance longer than intended, moving closer to the water without realizing it. The danger here is collective distraction, the way a group can lose track of individuals when attention scatters. In some regions, Nukken was associated with specific bodies of water, a particular lake, a known stretch of river, a pool where the current behaved strangely. These places were not forbidden, but they were approached with care. Children were taught to be cautious near them, not through frightening stories, but through quiet emphasis. These places were noted, they were remembered, behavior adjusted accordingly. The story did not suggest that all water was dangerous, or that Nukken was everywhere. Instead, it suggested that certain places and certain conditions aligned to create risk. Still water at dusk, solitary moments, times when attention naturally wandered. These were not extraordinary circumstances. They were part of daily life. The story simply made them easier to name. Across all versions involving children, the tone remains restrained. There is no emphasis on suffering or terror. The focus is on absence and on the gradual way that distance increases. The story does not attempt to frighten. It attempts to remind. It reinforces patterns of behavior that already existed, offering a shape to concerns that were already present. What allows these versions to feel natural rather than constructed is their alignment with real conditions. Water was genuinely risky, especially for children. Drowning was a common cause of loss, and it often happened quietly, without witnesses or clear explanation. The story did not create this fear, It reflected it, giving it a form that could be discussed without dwelling on painful specifics. In this way, Nuken served a function that was practical as well as cultural. It provided a way to talk about risk that children could remember, that felt immediate without being graphic, and that reinforced caution without requiring detailed explanation. The story existed alongside other forms of teaching, complementing rather than replacing them. As time passed and these versions circulated, they became familiar enough that a simple mention was sufficient. Parents did not need to tell the full story. They could simply reference it, and the child would understand. This efficiency allowed the story to persist with minimal effort, passed down through brief reminders rather than lengthy retellings. And so the story remained, flexible and understated, adapting to different waters and different communities, always reflecting the same underlying pattern: proximity to water, moments of solitude, a gradual shift from safety to risk. These elements were not dramatized. They were simply observed, noted, and remembered, woven into the background of daily life where they felt natural and unremarkable. To understand why stories like the one associated with Nuken felt natural rather than extraordinary, it helps to step away from the story itself and spend time with the world in which it existed. This was a world shaped by routine, repetition, and close attention to the environment. Not because people sought meaning in every detail, but because daily life required it. Small changes mattered. Water levels, weather patterns, and light all influenced decisions constantly, often without being consciously acknowledged. In many rural areas throughout the Nordic regions, daily life followed patterns that shifted with the seasons. Work began early and continued as long as light allowed, especially during summer months when daylight stretched long into the evening. People planned tasks carefully, knowing that unfinished work might need to wait and that conditions could change. Water played a central role in these routines. It was where clothes were washed, where animals were led to drink, where fish were caught, and where boats were launched for travel or transport. During warmer months, water was a constant presence in daily activity. Children played near shores. Adults worked along banks. Boats moved regularly between settlements. This familiarity bred both comfort and caution. People knew which areas were shallow and which were not. They knew where currents were strong. They knew when water levels rose after rain. This knowledge was gained through experience and observation, passed down through demonstration rather than formal instruction. Summer evenings were particularly significant. As light faded slowly over hours, the quality of the environment changed. Sound carried differently over water. Shadows lengthened, temperatures dropped gradually. These transitions were neither abrupt nor dramatic, but they were noticeable. People adapted their activities accordingly, moving indoors or adjusting their pace. The shift from day to evening was not marked by clocks or schedules. It was felt and responded to naturally. During these evening hours, water often became still. Wind died down. Surfaces reflected sky and landscape with increasing clarity. This stillness was beautiful, but it also created conditions where depth became harder to judge and where the boundary between water and air seemed less certain. Reflections could be mistaken for substance. Distances could be misjudged. This was not considered mysterious or supernatural. It was simply understood as part of how water behaved. Isolation was common, particularly in less densely populated regions. Settlements were separated by forests, hills, and waterways. Travel between them required time and planning. People became accustomed to spending long periods within small communities or even alone. This isolation was not necessarily distressing. It was expected, and people adapted to it as part of life. However, it did mean that disappearances were felt acutely and that searches were often inconclusive. When someone failed to return from a task near water, explanations were limited. Accidents were common enough that they did not require elaborate reasoning. Someone might slip on wet rocks. A boat might overturn unexpectedly. A current might prove stronger than anticipated. These were understood risks, accepted as part of living near water. But in cases where no clear cause could be determined, where no body was found, or where circumstances seemed particularly inexplicable, stories like that of Nukan provided an alternative framework. This framework was not offered as definitive truth. It was simply another way of understanding loss, one that aligned with cultural memory and shared imagery. Saying that someone encountered Nukan was not necessarily different from saying they were taken by the water. Both statements acknowledge the same outcome without claiming to explain it fully. The story did not replace practical understanding. It coexisted with it. Seasonal changes influenced how people interacted with water. During spring, snowmelt raised water levels dramatically. Rivers that had been calm became turbulent. Lakes expanded beyond their usual boundaries. Travel routes changed. People adjusted their movements accordingly, avoiding certain areas and waiting for conditions to stabilize. These changes were predictable in a general sense, but varied in detail from year to year. Observation and caution were essential. Summer brought different conditions. Heat could cause water levels to drop, exposing rocks and shallow areas that were submerged at other times. This altered navigation routes and made certain stretches more difficult to cross. Algae bloomed in warmer water, changing its appearance and sometimes its smell. These changes were noted without alarm, simply incorporated into ongoing awareness of the environment. Autumn introduced its own rhythms. Temperatures cooled, daylight shortened more noticeably. Water became colder, making accidental immersion more dangerous. Ice began to form along edges, creating unstable surfaces that looked solid but were not. This transitional period required particular attention. Stories associated with Nukan often surfaced more frequently during these times, not because the figure was believed to be more active, but because conditions naturally prompted reminders about caution. Winter transformed the relationship with water entirely. Lakes and rivers froze, creating surfaces that could be crossed, but that also carried significant risk. Ice thickness varied. Currents beneath affected stability. Cracks could form without warning. People learned to read ice to judge its safety through color, sound, and texture. This knowledge was essential for survival, and it was taught carefully through observation and experience. During winter, the landscape felt different. Frozen water became part of the terrain rather than a boundary. Sounds changed. Movement across ice required different techniques than movement across land or through water. The environment imposed new constraints and offered new possibilities. Stories adapted to these conditions, though Nukan itself was less commonly mentioned in winter contexts. The figure belonged primarily to open water, to twilight, to the transitional seasons when water's character felt most uncertain. Homes near water were positioned with care. They needed to be close enough for practical access, but far enough to avoid flooding. Your windows often faced water, allowing observation of changing conditions. This visual connection reinforced constant awareness. People noticed when water levels shifted, when colors changed, when unusual patterns appeared on the surface. These observations were not dramatic or particularly significant. They were simply part of daily attention. Evenings were long, particularly during darker months. With limited artificial light, activities naturally slowed after sunset. People gathered indoors, worked quietly on tasks that did not require strong light or simply rested. Conversation during these hours was unhurried. Stories did not interrupt the quiet. They blended into it, shared without emphasis or expectation. A story might be mentioned briefly, then set aside, only to return later when circumstances felt appropriate. Food preparation often involved water. Fish needed to be cleaned. Vegetables needed to be washed. Water needed to be carried from wells or shores to homes. These tasks created regular interaction with water sources, reinforcing familiarity and maintaining awareness. Children participated in these activities, learning through repetition rather than instruction. The practical knowledge gained through these tasks included an understanding of when and where to be cautious. Boats were essential tools, maintained carefully and treated with respect. Building and repairing boats was skilled work passed down through generations. People understood how boats responded to different conditions, how weight needed to be distributed, how currents affected movement. This practical knowledge existed alongside stories like that of Nukin. They did not contradict each other. They addressed different aspects of the same relationship with water. Fishing provided sustenance and shaped daily routines. People knew which areas were productive, which times of day were most favorable, which techniques worked in different conditions. This knowledge was gained through experience and shared through demonstration. Fishing required patience, attention, and acceptance of uncertainty. Some days were productive, others were not. This variability was accepted as part of the process. The sounds of water were constant, waves lapping against shores, rain falling on surfaces, rivers moving over rocks, ice cracking in cold. These sounds formed part of the background of daily life, so familiar that they often went unnoticed unless they changed. An unexpected sound or an unexpected silence could draw attention immediately. This sensitivity to environmental cues was developed naturally through constant exposure. Children grew up with water as part of their world. They learned to swim, to navigate boats, to recognize dangerous conditions. This learning happened gradually through supervised experience and careful observation. Stories like that of Nukin existed alongside this practical education, offering additional context without replacing direct teaching. The story reinforced caution without explaining every detail. It provided a memorable framework that complemented practical knowledge. As people aged, their relationship with water evolved. Older individuals might avoid certain activities they once managed easily. They might rely more on accumulated knowledge than physical capability. Their memories held generations of observation, including unusual events, near accidents, and losses. These memories informed how they spoke about water, how they taught younger generations, and how they responded to stories like that of Nukin. The environment itself reinforced these patterns. Water was genuinely powerful, genuinely unpredictable, and genuinely essential. Respect for it was not abstract or symbolic. It was practical and immediate. Stories that reflected this respect felt natural because they aligned with lived experience. They did not need to exaggerate to be meaningful. They simply needed to reflect what people already knew. Over time, certain places accumulated associations. A stretch of shore where someone once disappeared. A deep pool where currents behaved strangely. A narrow passage where boats sometimes struggled. These associations were not always formalized or discussed openly, but they influenced behavior. People approached such places with additional caution, made different decisions, adjusted their routes. Stories like that of Nukan often attached to these specific locations, reinforcing existing wariness without creating new fear. Community memory preserved these associations across generations. Grandparents mentioned them to parents, parents noted them to children. The information passed down was often minimal, a place name, a brief caution, sometimes just a look or a gesture that conveyed meaning without words. This economy of communication was possible because the underlying context was shared and understood. Seasonal festivals and gatherings often took place near water. These events brought communities together, creating moments of shared celebration and activity. During such times, the usual caution might relax slightly. Attention scattered across many people and activities. Stories like that of Nukan were sometimes mentioned during these gatherings, not as entertainment, but as gentle reminders that even during celebration, awareness should not disappear entirely. Weather shaped everything. Rain altered water levels and visibility. Wind affected boats and created waves. Fog reduced clear sight. Thunder signaled approaching storms. People paid constant attention to these signs, adjusting plans and activities accordingly. This attention was not anxious or fearful. It was simply practical, part of living in close relationship with an environment that required responsiveness. Understanding this broader context helps explain why stories like this endured without needing to be emphasized. They were not extraordinary additions to daily life. They were reflections of it. They mirrored the way people moved through the world, responded to uncertainty, and adapted to changing conditions. And it is within this quiet, patient environment that such stories found their place, remaining present without insistence, ready to return whenever circumstances felt familiar enough to bring them back. As daily life continued near water, time itself seemed to move differently. Days near lakes and rivers followed rhythms that were distinct from those of inland settlements. Mornings were often marked by mist rising from surfaces, slowly clearing as light strengthened. These transitions were neither sudden nor dramatic, but they created distinct phases within each day. Activities aligned with these phases naturally, without rigid scheduling. Water's surface acted as a mirror for changing light. Dawn brought subtle color shifts that were reflected and amplified. Midday brightness could make the surface difficult to look at directly. Evening brought deepening tones that shifted from blue to gray to nearly black. These changes were predictable, yet endlessly variable, offering familiarity without exact repetition. People noticed them without necessarily remarking on them, incorporating the information unconsciously into their sense of time and condition. The relationship between land and water created natural boundaries that influenced movement and thinking. Water defined where one could go easily and where one could not. It determined which settlements could communicate regularly and which remained more isolated. These boundaries were not absolute. Boats crossed them. Shallow areas allowed wading. Winter ice transformed them entirely, but the boundaries existed nonetheless, shaping daily decisions and long-term planning. Children understood these boundaries intuitively. They learned through experience where they could play safely and where they should not go alone. This learning was reinforced through repetition rather than prohibition. A parent might redirect a child away from deeper water without lengthy explanation. An older sibling might demonstrate safe areas through example. The knowledge accumulated gradually, becoming internalized behavior rather than conscious rule following. Solitude near water was a common experience, particularly for those engaged in tasks like fishing, washing, or tending animals. These activities often happened in relative isolation, even in populated areas. The nature of the tasks meant that people spread out along shores or moved to areas where others were not present. This solitude was not remarkable. It was simply how certain work was done. However, it did create conditions where attention could turn inward, where time could seem to stretch, and where the environment felt more present than usual. During these solitary moments, the mind often wandered. Repetitive tasks did not require constant focus, allowing thoughts to drift. In this state, people might notice things they would otherwise overlook. Patterns on the water's surface, particular sounds, shifts in light or temperature. This heightened noticing was not deliberate or unusual. It was simply what happened when attention was not directed elsewhere. Stories like that of Nukan found natural space in these moments. A person working alone near water might remember a story, or think about a place where something once happened, or simply feel the atmosphere that such stories described. The story did not need to be consciously recalled in full. It existed as part of the background awareness, ready to surface when circumstances felt familiar. Waiting was an inherent part of life near water. Waiting for fish to bite, waiting for boats to arrive, waiting for weather to improve, waiting for water levels to change. This waiting was not framed as idleness or frustration. It was understood as necessary, as part of the natural rhythm. People learned to be comfortable with stillness, to occupy themselves without urgency. This patience shaped how they experienced time and how they related to their environment. Seasonal markers were observed through changes in water. The first ice formation, the last freeze, the return of certain fish species, the arrival of migratory birds. These markers were noted without ceremony, simply acknowledged as part of the ongoing cycle. They provided continuity and predictability, reinforcing the sense that despite constant change, certain patterns remained reliable. Emotional responses to water varied with experience. For some, it represented security and provision. For others, it carried associations with loss or near accidents. Most people held complex feelings that included both appreciation and wariness. This emotional complexity was rarely discussed directly, but it influenced behavior subtly. Decisions about where to go, when to travel, and what risks to accept were shaped by these accumulated feelings. Community relationships were also influenced by water. Settlements connected by waterways maintained regular contact. Those separated by difficult stretches were more isolated. Help could arrive quickly across calm water. It might not arrive at all across turbulent conditions. These practical realities shaped social structures, determining which communities felt closely connected and which felt distant despite relatively short physical distances. Stories traveled along these same routes. News, gossip, and legends moved with boats and travelers. A story told in one settlement might reach another within days or weeks, depending on conditions. As stories moved, they changed slightly, adapted to new contexts, merged with local details. This fluidity meant that no single authoritative version existed. Each telling was shaped by the teller and the audience, creating variations that nevertheless retained core similarities. The story of Nukan moved through these networks naturally. It was not carried with intention or purpose. It was simply mentioned when relevant, when circumstances suggested it, or when someone thought of it. Sometimes it was told to children as a cautionary reminder. Sometimes it was mentioned among adults during conversation about water or travel. Sometimes it surfaced in the context of a specific place or a remembered event. Each mention reinforced the story's presence without requiring formal retelling. As people moved through their days, they carried accumulated knowledge from multiple sources: practical experience, observation, instruction from elders, stories heard over time. All of these sources blended together, informing decisions without clear separation between them. A person might avoid a particular spot near water without consciously remembering whether they did so because of direct experience, a warning from a parent, or a story heard years earlier. The distinction did not matter. The behavior was reinforced through multiple channels. This integration of story and practice meant that legends like that of Nukan were not separate from daily life. They were woven into it, part of the fabric of knowledge and awareness that shaped how people moved through the world. The story did not stand out as fiction or belief. It existed in the same space as other forms of understanding, neither more nor less valid than practical observation or inherited wisdom. Memory played a crucial role in maintaining these patterns. People remembered their own experiences near water. They remembered stories told by grandparents. They remembered specific places and the feelings those places evoked. These memories were not always accurate or complete, but they created a framework through which new experiences were interpreted. A moment of disorientation near water might be understood through the lens of remembered stories, giving it shape and context. Children heard fragments of these stories long before they encountered water alone. They absorbed the basic patterns through casual mentions, references made in passing, tones of voice used when speaking about certain places. By the time they had their own independent experiences near water, the stories were already familiar enough to feel natural. This gradual exposure meant that the story never felt imposed or artificial. It felt like something that had always been known. As individuals aged and accumulated their own experiences, their relationship with these stories shifted. What once felt distant and abstract became connected to personal memory. A story heard in childhood might be recalled after a close call or a moment of particular stillness. The story would not feel more true or false in that moment. It would simply feel more present, more relevant. This shifting relevance kept the story alive without requiring anyone to actively preserve it. The passage of seasons reinforced this ongoing relationship. Each year brought new experiences near water. Each summer saw children playing on shores. Each autumn brought transitional conditions that prompted caution. Each winter transformed water entirely. These cycles created constant renewal of the conditions in which stories like that of Nukan felt natural. The story did not need to be retold frequently because the environment itself recreated the context in which the story made sense, even as time passed. And circumstances changed. Certain elements remained consistent. Water continued to be essential. It continued to be unpredictable. It continued to require respect and attention. As long as these fundamentals held true, stories that reflected them retained relevance. They might fade somewhat during periods when water felt less immediately risky, but they would return when conditions shifted, when losses occurred, or when new generations began their own relationships with lakes and rivers. Understanding this integration of story and life helps clarify why legends like that of Nukan persisted for so long without institutional support or formal preservation. They did not need to be maintained deliberately. They survived because they fit naturally into the rhythms of living. They accompanied experience without dominating it. They offered frameworks for understanding without insisting on explanation, and they remained present in the background, ready to surface whenever circumstances felt familiar enough to bring them back. Stories like the one associated with Nukan rarely existed alone. They were remembered alongside other stories that arose from similar conditions, shaped by comparable environments and shared experiences. These stories were not grouped together intentionally, nor were they compared in a formal way. Instead, they existed side by side, connected quietly through repetition and familiarity. Over time, people came to recognize certain similarities without needing to name them, simply because the stories felt related. In regions where water shaped daily life, stories often reflected the same underlying concerns. Boundaries were uncertain, attention could waver, isolation was common. These experiences were not unique to one place or one culture. Wherever people lived near water and depended on their ability to navigate it safely, similar stories emerged. They did not copy one another directly. They developed independently, responding to the same kinds of conditions. Many of these stories involved encounters that occurred during moments of vulnerability. Someone working alone near shore, a child wandering near deep water, a person caught out as light faded. The figures encountered in these stories were rarely aggressive or overtly threatening. They appeared calmly, often without warning, and their presence marked a shift rather than an attack. The danger lay not in confrontation, but in the circumstances surrounding the encounter. In some stories, the figure appeared at the water's edge, in a position that seemed unusual or prolonged. In others, the figure emerged from the water itself, or seemed to be part of it. These locations were not chosen for dramatic effect. They reflected real points of transition, where safety was uncertain and decisions carried greater weight. Stories that unfolded in these spaces reinforced the importance of awareness without stating it directly. Across different regions, similar figures were described as pale, quiet, and unhurried. They did not rush toward people or pursue them. They observed, waited, or moved alongside, demonstrating ease where humans struggled. This contrast emphasized human vulnerability without assigning blame or intention. The figures did not need to act forcefully. Their difference alone was enough to shape the encounter. Some stories emphasized music more than form. A sound carried across water, difficult to locate or identify. It might draw attention, create distraction, or simply mark the presence of something other. These stories did not always specify what produced the sound. The sound itself was sufficient. It represented something beyond normal experience, something that belonged to the water rather than to the human world. In other tellings, the focus shifted to transformation. Figures that seemed human revealed themselves to be otherwise. Animals that appeared calm showed unexpected behavior. These transformations were not framed as deception. They were presented as revelation, moments when the true nature of something became apparent. The story did not judge the figure for this reveal. It simply noted what occurred. Many related stories also involved conditions or boundaries. A figure might allow passage only if a simple rule was followed. The rule was rarely complex. It might involve silence, respect, or restraint. These conditions were not enforced through punishment. When they were broken, the figure withdrew rather than retaliated. The connection ended quietly. This pattern reinforced the idea that some encounters were temporary by nature and not meant to be sustained. In coastal regions, similar stories emerged in different settings. Instead of lakes and rivers, the environment involved tides, rocky shores, and deeper waters. Figures appeared during specific conditions, often when fog reduced visibility or when currents shifted unpredictably. The danger lay in the environment rather than the figure. These stories shared the same tone as inland water legends, emphasizing caution without dramatization. Forest regions where streams and springs were common produced their own variations. Figures associated with flowing water, with sources and confluences, with places where water emerged from or disappeared into the ground. These stories reflected attention to water's movement, to its appearance and disappearance, to its role in connecting different parts of the landscape. Across all of these stories, a lack of origin was common. Figures were rarely given detailed histories or explanations. They simply existed, appearing when conditions allowed and disappearing when circumstances changed. This absence of backstory mirrored how people experienced the natural world itself. Water did not require explanation to be respected. It was accepted as it was. As stories were repeated over time, details shifted. Names changed, settings varied, certain elements were emphasized or omitted. But the underlying structure remained consistent. Encounters occurred during moments of vulnerability. Outcomes were quiet rather than dramatic. Meaning was suggested rather than stated. These shared patterns allowed stories to remain familiar even as circumstances changed. People did not need to consciously compare these stories to recognize their similarities. The connections formed naturally through repetition and shared experience. Hearing one story made another feel familiar, even if the details differed. This familiarity reinforced cultural memory without requiring formal instruction or explanation. In this way, stories supported one another quietly. They formed a loose network of ideas rather than a rigid system. Each story reflected a slightly different aspect of the same lived reality, reinforcing common understandings through variation rather than exact repetition. This network did not demand attention. It existed in the background, shaping expectations subtly over time. By recognizing these shared patterns, listeners could understand each story not as an isolated event, but as part of a broader landscape of experience. The story we are exploring fits naturally within this landscape, not as a central example, but as one expression among many. It exists alongside other stories that developed under similar conditions, shaped by similar concerns, and remembered in similar ways, continuing quietly without insistence, ready to surface whenever circumstances felt familiar enough to bring it back. As these stories continued to circulate over time, their similarities became familiar even to those who could not have named them. People did not need to compare details or trace origins to sense that certain stories belonged together. The connection was felt rather than understood, shaped by repeated exposure and shared experience. Hearing one story made another feel recognizable, not because the events were the same, but because the atmosphere was. The same quiet tension, the same emphasis on waiting, restraint, and awareness, the same absence of urgency. Across many regions and cultures, stories emerged that reflected moments when the ordinary world felt slightly altered. These moments were not dramatic. They did not involve sudden danger or clear transformation. Instead, they occurred when familiar routines were disrupted just enough to feel uncertain. A task took longer than expected. Light faded earlier than anticipated. Conditions changed subtly. In these moments, stories often placed a figure nearby, not as a threat, but as a sign that circumstances had shifted. In these stories, the figures encountered were often calm and composed. They did not rush or raise their voices. Their presence did not create chaos. Instead, it highlighted what was already there: isolation, vulnerability, reduced awareness. This quality made the stories feel realistic rather than fantastical. The figures did not introduce danger, they revealed it. A recurring emotional theme in many of these legends is quiet uncertainty. Characters rarely know exactly what they are encountering, and they are not given clear instructions on how to respond. There is no guide, no explanation, and no authoritative voice. The story unfolds without telling the listener what to think. This mirrors real experiences, where people often must make decisions without full information, relying on intuition, habit, and past experience. Another shared element is the absence of reward. In many stories, nothing positive is gained from the encounter. Survival is not celebrated. Avoidance is not praised. The best possible outcome is often simply continuation. Life goes on as it did before, unchanged and unremarkable. This lack of reward reinforces the idea that the encounter was not meant to be meaningful in a dramatic sense. It was simply part of the environment. Similarly, punishment is rarely emphasized. When harm occurs, it is not framed as deserved or intentional. It happens quietly without judgment. This approach avoids moralizing the story, allowing it to remain open and adaptable. The listener is not instructed to behave a certain way. They are simply shown what can happen under certain conditions. These stories also share a tendency to avoid clear endings. Encounters often conclude without explanation. The figure disappears, the journey continues, or life resumes without resolution. This lack of closure is not presented as a problem. It reflects how many experiences end in reality without understanding or certainty. The story accepts this without attempting to correct it. In many cases, the figures within these stories are associated with specific times rather than specific actions. They appear at dusk during transitional seasons or at moments when attention naturally wanders. This timing reinforces their connection to the environment rather than to human behavior. The figure is not summoned by wrongdoing or intent. It arrives when conditions align. Because of this, the stories feel less like cautionary tales and more like observations. They do not instruct listeners to avoid certain actions. They describe what has been noticed over time. This observational quality gives the stories a sense of neutrality. They are not warnings issued by authority. They are reflections of experience. Another pattern that appears repeatedly is the role of attention. In many stories, those who remain alert, who notice small changes, or who continue moving tend to fare better than those who stop or become distracted. This emphasis is subtle. It is not framed as advice. It emerges naturally from the way events unfold. The story does not say that attentiveness will ensure safety. It simply shows that inattention can be risky. Silence plays an important role in reinforcing these themes. Conversations, when they occur, are brief and understated. Often, the most significant moments happen without words. The absence of dialogue creates space for the listener's own experiences to fill in the gaps. This openness allows the story to resonate differently with each person, depending on what they bring to it. These shared patterns also reflect a broader cultural relationship with uncertainty. In many of the environments where these stories developed, unpredictability was a constant presence. Water levels changed, travel was delayed, plans were interrupted. Rather than seeking control, people learned to adapt. Stories mirrored this approach. They did not promise solutions. They acknowledged limits. As societies changed and daily life became more structured and predictable, many of these stories were reinterpreted. They were written down, categorized, and sometimes explained in ways that earlier versions avoided. However, the older forms persisted alongside these adaptations, remembered for their restraint rather than their detail. The quiet versions continued to circulate, valued for their atmosphere rather than their clarity. The story associated with Nukin fits naturally within this broader pattern. It shares the same calm tone, the same emphasis on environment, and the same avoidance of clear resolution. It does not stand out because it is more dramatic or more complete. It stands out because it reflects a familiar way of understanding the world, one that accepts uncertainty without resistance. By viewing this story alongside others that share similar qualities, its role becomes clearer. It is not meant to instruct, entertain, or explain. It is meant to accompany experience, to exist quietly in the background of memory, ready to surface when circumstances feel familiar enough to bring it back. Its meaning, if it has one at all, is not contained in its details, but in its tone. These shared patterns allowed stories like this to persist without needing reinforcement. They were not preserved intentionally. They survived because they fit naturally into the rhythms of life. They did not demand attention. They waited, and when conditions aligned, they returned, not as lessons or warnings, but as familiar presences, reminding listeners of experiences they already understood, even if they could not fully explain them. When stories like the one associated with Nukin are remembered over long periods of time, they naturally gather layers of interpretation. These interpretations were not usually discussed openly or debated. Instead, they existed quietly, shaped by personal experience, local conditions, and the moment in which the story was heard. Meaning was not fixed or agreed upon. It shifted gently, allowing the story to remain familiar without becoming rigid. For some listeners, the story was understood as a reflection of water itself. Lakes and rivers were essential but unpredictable. Personifying these forces allowed people to speak about them indirectly. without needing to describe risk in literal terms. In this understanding, Nukken was not a character with intention or desire, but a way of giving form to conditions that already existed. The story did not suggest that water was malicious. It simply acknowledged that water was indifferent, and that indifference could be dangerous. Others understood the story as a quiet reminder of human limits. No matter how familiar a place might seem, no matter how experienced a person was, conditions could change. Attention could waver. Small decisions could have lasting consequences. The story did not frame these ideas as moral lessons. It did not suggest that mistakes were punished. Instead, it reflected the reality that the environment does not adjust itself to human plans. Some interpretations focus less on danger and more on awareness. In many tellings, harm occurs not because of an active threat, but because of distraction. Stopping too long, failing to notice changes, becoming absorbed in something other than immediate surroundings. These moments are not dramatic, they are ordinary. The story highlights them quietly, allowing listeners to recognize patterns without being told what to think. There are also interpretations that emphasize boundaries. Nukken often appears at edges, along shores, at places where land meets water. These are spaces where certainty is reduced. The story does not suggest that these boundaries should be avoided entirely. It suggests that they require care. Crossing them is not forbidden, but it is not without risk. This understanding aligns closely with lived experience, where many situations are not clearly safe or dangerous, but exist somewhere in between. In versions of the story that involve music, interpretations often shift toward ideas of allure and distraction. The music does not force anyone to do anything. It simply draws attention, creates fascination, makes time pass differently. This reflects real experiences of becoming absorbed, of losing track of time, of being drawn towards something without fully choosing to move. The story acknowledges that attraction can be powerful without being malicious. Another interpretation centers on loneliness. In some tellings, Nukken is distant rather than threatening. It appears briefly, interacts minimally, and then disappears. This portrayal resonates with environments where isolation is common, especially during long periods when travel is difficult. From this perspective, the story reflects the emotional landscape of people who lived with extended periods of solitude. The figure becomes less a danger and more a presence shaped by separation and stillness. Some listeners understood the story simply as tradition, without seeking deeper meaning at all. It was something that had always been told, and so it continued to be told. In this view, the value of the story lies not in what it represents, but in the act of remembering it. Sharing the story reinforces continuity, connecting one generation to the next without requiring explanation. This interpretation does not diminish the story. It reflects a different way of valuing it. Importantly, these interpretations did not replace one another. They existed simultaneously, overlapping and shifting depending on context. A story might feel like a warning in one moment and like a reflection of nature in another. It might feel distant and abstract to one listener and deeply personal to another. This openness allowed the story to adapt without changing its structure. It could mean different things at different times without losing its identity. The lack of a clear conclusion in the story supports this openness. There is no final judgment, no definitive lesson, and no authoritative explanation. Events unfold, and then they end. This mirrors real experience, where outcomes are not always understood and meaning is not always clear. The story does not resolve uncertainty. It allows it to remain. Because of this, interpretation becomes part of the listening experience rather than a destination. Meaning may emerge quietly, or it may not emerge at all. The story does not insist on being understood. It offers space instead. Space for reflection, space for familiarity, space for rest. This quality makes the story particularly suited to moments of quiet. It does not compete for attention. It does not demand analysis. It exists comfortably alongside other thoughts, allowing the mind to drift without resistance. Interpretation, if it occurs, does so gently, without effort. By remaining open and unresolved, the story avoids becoming fixed or outdated. It remains flexible, able to coexist with changing circumstances and new perspectives. Listeners are free to bring their own experiences into the story, finding familiarity without being directed toward a specific understanding. This freedom is not emphasized or explained. It is simply present, waiting quietly, like the story itself. As these interpretations continued to exist side by side, they did not compete with one another. No single understanding replaced the others, and none was treated as more correct or complete. Instead, they layered gently, allowing the story associated with Nuken to remain flexible and open. This flexibility was not accidental. It reflected a way of thinking that accepted uncertainty as part of life rather than something that needed to be resolved. For some listeners, the story was less about danger and more about balance. Water demanded awareness. Pushing too hard, ignoring changes, or refusing to adapt could lead to harm. In this understanding, the story does not punish carelessness, nor does it reward caution explicitly. It simply reflects what happens when balance is lost. The environment responds without emotion, and the story mirrors that response. Others interpreted the story as a reminder of how easily familiar things can change. A shore visited many times becomes unfamiliar in different light. A calm surface conceals strong currents. A moment of distraction alters the course of events. These changes are not framed as dramatic turning points. They are subtle shifts, recognized only after they occur. The story captures this gradual transition, allowing listeners to recognize the feeling without being directed toward a specific lesson. There are interpretations that focus on the role of memory. In many versions, encounters with Nuken are remembered imperfectly or spoken of only in fragments. Details blur, timelines fade. What remains is not a clear sequence of events, but an impression. This reflects how memory often works in real life, especially around experiences shaped by stress, isolation, or strong emotion. The story does not attempt to correct this. It allows memory to remain uncertain. Some listeners understood the story as a reflection of emotional states rather than physical conditions. Long periods near water, extended isolation, and limited interaction could affect mood and perception. Feelings of heaviness, detachment, or distance might be expressed through imagery rather than words. In this view, Nuken becomes less a figure encountered in the world and more a presence that represents emotional stillness or withdrawal. The story does not insist on this interpretation, but it allows room for it. Other interpretations focus on impermanence. Encounters with Nuken are brief. The figure does not linger. It does not become part of the person's ongoing life. Even in versions where extended interaction occurs, the presence is temporary. The story does not treat this impermanence as tragic or unjust. It presents it as natural. Things arrive, things depart. Not everything is meant to last. Some listeners viewed the story as a reminder that not all encounters are meant to be fully understood. Some experiences exist without clear explanation. Some moments feel significant without leading anywhere. This understanding aligns with many aspects of life, where meaning is not always apparent and resolution is not always achieved. The story reflects this without explanation or judgment. Another recurring interpretation centers on respect. Water commands respect through its power and unpredictability. Nukan embodies that quality, appearing when respect has wavered or attention has lapsed. This interpretation does not frame the figure as enforcing rules or punishing disrespect. Instead, it suggests that the figure appears naturally when the relationship between person and environment has shifted, when awareness has dimmed, or when boundaries have been approached without sufficient care. Over time, listeners may move between interpretations without noticing. A story heard as a child may feel mysterious. The same story heard later may feel practical. Heard again, it may feel symbolic or distant. The story allows this movement. It does not require consistency. It adapts to the listener rather than demanding a fixed understanding. Because of this, interpretation becomes a personal experience rather than a shared conclusion. Two people can hear the same story and carry away entirely different impressions, both valid within their own contexts. The story does not correct them. It does not insist on alignment. It remains open. This openness is reinforced by the way the story ends, or rather, does not end. There is no resolution that ties meaning together. There is no final statement that clarifies intent. The story simply stops, leaving space rather than filling it. This absence invites reflection without demanding it. In moments of quiet, this quality becomes especially noticeable. The story does not intrude on rest. It does not provoke thought unless thought naturally arises. It allows the listener to drift, carrying whatever impression feels appropriate and letting the rest fade away. Interpretation, if it happens at all, happens gently. By remaining unresolved, the story avoids becoming fixed in time. It continues to exist as something that can be returned to without effort, adapting to new circumstances and new listeners. Without needing to change its form, its meaning is not contained in its details, but in its ability to remain present without insistence. And so, the story continues to exist in this open state, neither fully explained nor entirely mysterious, offering impressions rather than answers, and allowing each listener to decide how much, if anything, they wish to carry with them as the narration continues quietly onward. As stories like the one associated with Nukan gradually moved away from the center of daily life, they did not vanish so much as they softened. They became less urgent, less frequently spoken, and less clearly defined. Rather than being shared in full, they remained in fragments, impressions, and familiar names that resurfaced only when conditions felt right. This quiet persistence allowed the story to remain present without demanding attention, existing comfortably in the background of memory. Over time, the environments that once gave these stories their immediacy began to change. Travel became easier and safer. Access to water became more controlled. Communication improved, reducing isolation, Artificial light extended activity into hours that were once quiet. Yet, even as these changes took place, certain moments remained unchanged. Long periods of stillness near water, places where boundaries still felt uncertain, conditions that altered familiar landscapes without warning. In those moments, the feeling that once gave rise to stories like this could still be sensed, even if it was no longer named. The story does not attempt to return forcefully. It does not insist on being remembered. It waits quietly, resting beneath the surface of everyday experience. When circumstances align, when silence becomes noticeable, or when the environment feels unfamiliar again, the story surfaces naturally. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes present, like a familiar thought that returns without being summoned. As the narration continues now, there is no need to hold on to what has already been said. The details do not need to be retained, and the connections do not need to be traced. The story does not build toward a conclusion that needs to be recognized. Instead, it settles gradually, allowing the pace of thought to slow without effort. Attention can soften. Awareness can drift. Nothing important depends on staying focused. Stories like this were never designed to end sharply. They faded naturally, often interrupted by sleep, silence, or the simple passing of time. Their purpose was not to reach a final point, but to accompany a moment. Once that moment passed, the story rested until it was needed again, if it was needed at all. This quality made them especially suited to evenings and nights, when activity slowed and reflection came more easily. You may notice that the rhythm of the narration remains steady and unchanging. This steadiness is intentional. Just as the story does not build toward excitement, it does not move quickly toward rest. It maintains a consistent presence, offering familiarity rather than stimulation. This allows the mind to relax without being guided or directed. In quiet moments, the boundary between listening and not listening becomes less important. Words may register clearly for a time, then fade into the background. Thoughts may arise briefly, then dissolve. The story does not react to this shift. It continues unchanged, allowing each listener to engage with it in whatever way feels most comfortable. Imagine a setting where there is nothing to respond to and nothing to anticipate. A place where time moves without urgency and where stillness feels natural rather than empty. In such a space, stories do not stand out as separate events. They blend gently into the environment, becoming part of the atmosphere rather than something to follow. This is how stories like this were often experienced, not as performances, but as companions to quiet moments. They existed alongside routine, not interrupting it, and they ended not with resolution, but with rest. When sleep arrived, the story simply continued without the listener, unchanged and unconcerned. As attention softens, the story becomes less about content and more about rhythm, the steady movement of words, the predictable tone, the absence of urgency. These qualities allow the mind to release its grip on detail, drifting toward a state where thoughts no longer need to be organized or directed. If memories surface while listening, they can be allowed to pass without examination. If images form, they do not need to be held. The story does not encourage reflection or analysis. It provides a background in which such things can arise and fade naturally without effort. The quiet persistence of the story mirrors the way it has existed across time, not always present, but never entirely gone, waiting without expectation, returning without announcement. It does not ask to be remembered correctly or completely. It accepts partial memory and gradual fading as part of its nature. As the narration continues, it remains open-ended. There is no signal that it is nearing completion, no shift in tone to suggest that something is about to end. This lack of signaling allows rest to arrive naturally without interruption. Sleep, if it comes, does so quietly. And so the story remains steady and unhurried, offering no destination and no demand. It accompanies the moment as long as it is needed, and when it is no longer noticed, it continues quietly on its own, unchanged, patient, and at ease. As the story continues, it becomes less important to distinguish where one idea ends and another begins. The narration does not move forward with purpose or direction. It remains present, steady, and unhurried, allowing time to stretch naturally. This mirrors the way stories like the one associated with Nukken were often experienced, not as complete narratives, but as something that existed alongside rest, waiting, and quiet awareness. At this point, listening does not require effort. Words can be heard without being followed. Meaning can soften without disappearing. The story does not insist on clarity. It does not ask to be understood or remembered. It simply remains moving at a pace slow enough that attention no longer needs to hold on. In moments like this, the boundary between the story and the surrounding environment becomes less distinct. The sound of the narration blends with other quiet sounds, or with silence itself. The rhythm stays the same, offering predictability without emphasis. Nothing changes suddenly, nothing demands response. This is often how the end of the day was experienced in the environments where such stories emerged. Activity faded gradually. Tasks were set aside one by one. Light diminished. Conversation slowed. There was no clear transition from wakefulness to rest, only a gentle shift as awareness loosened. Stories accompanied this process without guiding it. As you continue listening, there is no need to monitor your thoughts. If they drift, they can drift. If they pause, they can pause. The story does not react. It does not follow your attention or attempt to regain it. It remains consistent, allowing the mind to settle at its own pace. In earlier times, long stretches of quiet were common. People became familiar with stillness, not as an absence, but as a presence in its own right. Stories that existed in this context reflected that familiarity. They did not compete with silence. They coexisted with it, leaving space rather than filling it completely. The narration now functions in the same way. It does not seek to replace silence. It rests beside it. If the words fade into the background, that is expected. If they return briefly to awareness, that is also fine. The story does not change in response. There is no moment you need to stay awake for, no detail that must be heard. The story does not build toward anything that could be missed. It remains even without variation, allowing rest to deepen without interruption. As time passes, the sense of sequence becomes less important. It no longer matters what came before or what might come next. The narration exists in the present moment only, repeating its calm presence without progression. This lack of movement is intentional. It allows the mind to disengage from anticipation. If sleep begins to arrive, it does so without ceremony. There is no final thought to hold on to, no closing image. The story does not mark the transition. It simply continues, unchanged, as awareness fades. This is how many stories were once experienced, not finished, not concluded, but left behind mid-thought, mid-sentence, mid-impression, as rest took over. The story did not need to be completed to have served its purpose. Its purpose was not completion, but accompaniment. Even now the narration does not suggest that anything is ending. It does not slow further or change tone. It does not prepare for silence. It maintains the same gentle rhythm, allowing the listener to leave without being guided out. If attention returns briefly, it finds the same calm presence waiting. Nothing has shifted. Nothing has progressed. The story remains exactly where it was, patient and unaltered. This steadiness creates a sense of safety without explanation. Nothing unexpected will occur. Nothing needs to be processed. The environment created by the narration remains stable, predictable, and unchanging. In this space, thoughts naturally lose their urgency. Memories loosen their grip. The mind no longer needs to arrange or resolve anything. The story does not provide answers or distractions. It provides continuity. As awareness softens further, the distinction between listening and resting becomes less meaningful. The story continues, but it no longer matters whether it is heard. Its presence alone is enough, and so it remains here, steady and quiet, without beginning or ending, without demand or direction, existing only as a calm background to rest, continuing on gently, patiently, and without interruption, allowing sleep to arrive in its own time.